Before we begin, don't forget that there are currently 3 applications out for the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll continue looking at a game which I described in an early video between me and a young player known as Addison Lee. In this game, we were able to take a look at the opening phase, which was the Tarrasch variation of the Queen's Gambit Declined. In today's video, we'll take a look at how the middle game and how the endgame panned out thereafter. The game began with the moves pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3 was played, pawn to d5, pawn to d4, pawn to c5, the Tarrasch variation of the Queen's Gambit Declined. White continued with the standard reply, pawn takes pawn on d5, pawn takes pawn on d5, knight to f3, now knight to c6, a critical move here, since black does need to make sure he controls the d4 square. The move pawn to e3 was played, knight to f6, bishop to e2, bishop to d6, castles kingside, pawn to a6, rook to e1, castles kingside, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, knight to d4, rook to e8, knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop to f3, and now bishop to f5, the position we left off with from the first video about this game. And now from here, black has different little tiny advantages in this position. Both of his bishops are slightly better placed than the opponent's bishop. In particular, right now, white's bishop on c1 is definitely out of play, whereas both of black's bishops have excellent scope. At the same time, black has a little bit of a space advantage in the center, as his pawn on d5 is further advanced than the pawn on e3, and this is contributing to some of the flexibility of black's play. Finally, both of black's rooks also have better prospects in this position, as black's rook on e8 is already situated on a semi-open file in comparison to the rook on e1, which is definitely not poised very well. And also, white's rook on a1 needs some time to position itself to c1. Now, to his credit, white has a slightly more compact and easily defended pawn structure, whereas black has weaknesses on the c6 and a6 point. These are both weakened pawns. The whole effort here from now on for black will be to prove that his piece activity can help him to deliver some threats and develop some threats, and at the same time to neutralize the weaknesses associated with these pawns on the queen side. And this can best be done by advancing the pawns up the board and using them to provoke and create weaknesses, rather than playing too slowly and allowing the pawns to turn into weaknesses themselves. Now let's take a look at how all of this played out. Now from here, play continued quite logically with the move pawn to b3, pawn to a5 was played, bishop to b2, and now the interesting move, bishop to b4, and this has a couple of points in mind. The first idea is to pin the knight on c3 so that it's not able to move out of the way and open up white's dark squared bishop. At the same time, by removing the bishop from the c5 location, black is beginning to make it possible to play the move pawn to c5 if an opportunity arises. Currently, he needs to be careful about potentially weakening the d5 pawn. But if black has an opportunity, he'd like to leave the c5 square available for the advancement of the c pawn. Finally, the move also potentially prepares the break pawn to a4, which can be used to pry open the b file, create weaknesses on the queen side, and convert the c pawn into a passed pawn in the event that white captures on a4. So black is sticking with the strategy of looking for ways to advance his pawns forward and also to maximize the possibilities given to him by his better piece placement. Now, it would certainly be possible for white to play the move pawn to a3, after which black would retreat the bishop to d6. Now, in this case, the pawns on the queen side have been softened up a bit. Therefore, white's queen on d1 will now have to be situated on d1 in order to protect the pawn on b3. So black can simply move his rook to the b1 square, and he can potentially think about queen b6, increasing the pressure, or he can simply leave the situation as is, and this will cause white some discomfort since he will not be able to develop his queen to a more active location without worrying about the defense of the b3 pawn. So the move pawn to a3 is a little bit difficult for white to achieve in this position. White continued with rook a to c1. And now I continued with the move queen to e7. It turns out, for a variety of reasons, the move queen to d6 may have been a little bit more pertinent in this position. The reason is related to the fact that in certain cases, black may begin to look for an attack on the king side. For example, in certain cases, black may play knight d7 to e5, attacking the light squared bishop. Then the queen, which is now situated on d6, can swing to g6, and with the bishop on f5, we can either move this bishop to h3 or to e4, depending on where this light squared bishop goes, and there are more attacking possibilities available for black. So I believe this move, queen to e7, which I played in the game, is a minor inaccuracy, which gives white slightly better equalizing chances if he is alert. Now we reach a moment where white made another small slip in this position, which had meaningful consequences. White now would like to begin to untangle his pieces and handle the fact of this pin by the bishop on b4. One way to do this is the way that my opponent chose in the game, rook to e2. But this was slightly clumsy here, and the rook on e2 is misplaced, as well as the bishop on f3. Instead, white may have tried the move queen to d4, centralizing the queen, and now preparing to play the move rook e to d1, when the rook would have considerably more scope and everything would be very well coordinated in this position. In fact, after the move queen d4, I believe the position is roughly equal. Instead, my opponent played the move rook to e2. And while this move does manage to untangle the knight on c3, the pieces remain a little bit uncoordinated. The bishop on f3, for example, is still vulnerable to this maneuver knight d7 to e5. Also, after what happened in the game, rook a to c8, and now knight to b1 with the idea of bringing this knight to d2, the rook on e2 continued to be vulnerable because of the possibility of bishop to d3, which can be played after knight to d2. So this particular strategy of remaneuvering the pieces has not worked out so well for white, and black's advantage is continuing to increase. Now, one strategy of play would be to bring the knight to d7 and to e5, making use of the bishop on f3's slightly vulnerable location, and also moving pieces towards the d3 square. And this is actually an excellent idea in the position. But the move which I played is also fairly good and straightforward. I simply retreated the bishop back to the d6 square, potentially aiming the bishop towards the king side, so that now a move like knight g4 has added thunder and possibility. Again, black can play the move knight to g4, and then he can either pressure h2, he can win the bishop pair, or the knight can be retreated to the e5 square, or the queen can come out to h4. So this idea of knight to g4 now becomes much more strong after the move bishop to d6. At the same time, the bishop is now out of the way, so that the move pawn to c5 is again becoming an option for black. As long as the bishop is on b4 in this position, and the bishop doesn't have anything to capture, the move pawn to c5 has some danger associated with the reply pawn to a3, as the bishop can be trapped on the b4 square. Therefore, the bishop retreats to d6. White now played knight to d2. And now I played the move bishop to d3, rook to e1, and then, annoyingly enough, I brought the bishop back to the b4 square. And again, this is all very similar to something we talked about in the first video about this game, that occasionally it's a good idea to create some psychological situations for the opponent. Why? Because chess can only be won if the opponent is eventually induced into making some kind of mistake. In addition to being able to strengthen our position with tactical and strategic means, it's also a very good idea to set the opponent some kind of problems, and this is something which strong players tend to be very, very good at. For example, if you look at games which Carlsen wins, the current world champion for example, you'll notice that a lot of the moves which are made may not have any sort of decisive consequence, but they do manage to set the opponent practical problems move after move. By moving the bishops back and forth in this way and setting small annoying problems for the opponent, my hope is to make the situation more ripe for white to make some sort of important mistake. Now, white is thrown again on the same problem of how to untangle his pieces and start to coordinate them in a meaningful way. The queen is still stuck on her home square, and the knight has still managed to find itself in a pin. To reply to this, my opponent played the move bishop to c3, which is certainly sensible, but instead, perhaps the move bishop to e2, bishop to f5, keeping the bishops on the board, and now the seemingly ugly move rook to f1, allowing this knight to become unpinned and then bringing it to f3 and then possibly to d4. I think this kind of plan would leave white with the minimal kind of problems in this position. However, instead of playing this retreating idea of bishop to e2 and rook to f1 and knight to f3, which admittedly is difficult to find and to actually play in the game, white played the move bishop to c3, setting up an exchange of dark squared bishops. Now, I finally had a chance to continue pawn to c5, advancing my second weakness up the board. Ideally, from here, if given an opportunity, black would like to advance the c-pawn even further up the board to the c4 square, creating a passed pawn after the exchange of pawns, and now eliminating all of the weaknesses, well, not eliminating the weaknesses, but converting the weakened pawns on the queen side into a passed pawn, and also creating a situation where white's pawn on a2 may be more susceptible to attack. And finally, the d file is now opened, and because black's pieces are better coordinated, black will be the first player to bring a rook to the d file and begin to create tactical threats. And also, the possibility of a knight maneuver, knight d7 to e5, is still an option on the board. So black is beginning to enact his plan of bringing the queenside pawns up the board, neutralizing their weak properties, and emphasizing their possibilities of advancing and creating weaknesses and passed pawns. White continued to make slight missteps and continued compliantly with the move bishop takes b4, allowing me to recapture with a takes b4 when the a file has now become open and the a2 pawn can definitely become a target. And additionally, the idea of pawn to c4 is still on the table. White played bishop to e2. Because of my space advantage, I retained bishops with bishop to f5. Knight to f3 was played. Rook to a8, attacking the a2 pawn. Rook to a1. Rook e to d8. Queen to d2 was played. Knight to e4, the infiltration's really getting strong here. Queen to b2, knight to c3. White continued, bishop to d1, rook a3 was played, and by now, black's advantage has become decisive. The knight is well situated on the c3 square, making use of this far advanced b4 pawn, and the rook is ready to come to the a1 square. Bishop c2 was played, trying to reduce the material. An exchange of bishops took place on the c2 square, and now I continued with the move queen to e4, and it's also possible to win material with the move rook d to a8 straight away. But I first inserted queen to e4, and the idea here is that if white takes with queen takes e4, black can either recapture with d takes e4 or the stronger move knight takes e4. And soon black will move the knight back to the c3 square, the rook will come to a8, that will create 3 attackers against the a2 pawn, and there's no way that white will be able to coordinate 3 defenders, and therefore the a2 pawn will be lost. Now, instead of capturing on e4, white continued with the move queen to b2. Rook d a8 was played. This is really becoming quite strong here. Knight to d2, queen to d3. And now the game came to a very quick end after white continued with the move knight to b1. Rook takes a2 was played. Rook takes a2. Rook takes a2. Queen to c1. Knight to e2 check. Rook takes e2. Queen takes e2. Now there's still only one move because of the threat of queen takes f2 followed by mate. Queen to f1 was played. Queen takes f1 check. King takes f1. And now white resigned after the move rook to a1. And it also turns out that the move rook to b2 is also possible here, winning the knight and ending the game ahead a piece. But the game ended rook a1 and white resigned. Black's attack finished very elegantly in this position. But the keys that I want to point out about this game are that black, first of all, employed the Queen's Gambit decline Tarrasch variation as a way of tripping white up a little bit from his standard English plans. As a result, white made a slight inaccuracy in the opening, which allowed black to attain immediate equality with some counterbalance chances. As the game went along, black was able to maximize the potential by his pieces, by his minor pieces and his rooks, and eventually, with some help from the opponent, white made a couple of mistakes which allowed black to continue increasing these points without white ever being able to fully untangle his pieces. Finally, the game ended in a rapid assault against the a2 pawn and an all-out infiltration against white's position. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, be sure to check out the 2 applications we have available for the King's Indian Defense, available for iPhone and for Android.